I understand. So I would not survive to a similar exercise anyway. Today, you see that there are a lot of young people and professors and colleagues here who are just to understand your ideas on the development of the way out from the crisis, a new deal, as you see, for the Europe. So we are perfectly aware that the European institutions are in a sort of unstable, to some extent, position so far. So the idea to convergence for the next future is very important for us. I will not add anything because it's Jean-Paul Fitoussi who will give a very short introduction, but we are here just for your presence, so very, very quickly both of us. So thank you again for coming. Jean-Paul.
Thank you very much, Massimo. It's a big honor for me to welcome Emmanuel Macron, who is the youngest minister of France, but I don't like this quality because I am against segregation by age. But he is more than that. He has a deep knowledge in many disciplines, from philosophy to math, and going through history and economics. So he is very well placed to find what our epoch needs. That is a new economic system, which is a more balanced system between democracy and the market. And in actuality, he is hotly debating of something which is called la loi Macron, which tries to give more balance to these two essential elements of our system. And I think that it is the right road to follow. We have had an enormous crisis, an European crisis, but before the financial crisis, which maybe are signing the end of an epoch. And we need to enter a new epoch, and we have to invent a new system to cope with our future. We have to build and to rebuild the future. And it is this question which are at the core of the action of Emmanuel Macron. It's why I'm very happy to welcome him here. I want just to ask him a small question, which is fairly simple to answer. What to do to repair Europe? Maybe you have a recipe. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to both of you for the introduction and the question, if I may say. And hello to everybody. That's okay, everybody hears me and everybody is all sit down. That's very impressive, basically, to see such a scene. So let me know if that's okay for you, if you prefer me, basically. Not to sit down and just... Okay, perfect. I'm impressed. Now, I wanted to say, perhaps as an introduction, a few words, indeed, about this way out of the crisis, and in a certain way, the answer to a question, Jean-Paul, about how to repair Europe. We have some first good news in the current context, and a slight recovery with, a low barrel oil price, with low interest rates, and the first, signals of a recovery. But at the same time, when you look at your unemployment rate, our unemployment rate, the average unemployment rate in Europe, I think we cannot find so many good news. And the situation today is a situation of a crisis. And even if a lot of people always repeat, we are exiting this crisis, I'm not so convinced. And when we look at the figure, I mean, 25% of our young people are unemployed in France, and in Italy it reaches more than 40%. So, I mean, something is wrong in the system, and we shouldn't, I mean, underestimate this, these first signals of recovery I just mentioned, because in the same time, today, we don't deliver in a certain way. We didn't repair Europe. And when you look at the most recent polls, I mean, the share of people who have a positive image of the EU is below the European average. 34%, that's the 39% in your country. And you were basically very much pro-European before crisis. That's the same thing in France. So my fear today, to be frank, is not just how to recover in Europe. And the big question mark is not just how to recover and to exit from these two crises. The first financial crisis of 2007-2008, and the second crisis between 2009 and 2012, which was both a financial, banking, sovereign crisis. But it's how to recover, repair the system from this crisis, but at the same time, how to find a new patient for Europe. How to find something new for Europe. Because, I mean, the founding fathers generation decided to make Europe a sort, I mean, not just a dream, but a common project, basically, to exit from the war, create a peaceful era, an era for growth and so on. Now, when you look at our situation, I mean, your generation, and probably you're an exception, but for your generation, Europe means austerity, unemployment, a lot of constraints and a lot of rules, no result. And when you look at the situation both from the economic and the political side, the main risk today is that this progressive divergence within Europe and these path failures, which led basically to the crisis, will be increased by the feeling of your generation and the fact that, I mean, the main risk is your affectio societatis, basically, for Europe, will be reduced because of this situation. So we have, for me, a sort of a dual challenge, which is not just basically fight against the current economic situation, but to recover, I mean, the historical and a renewed European dream and European project for, I mean, all of us and especially all of you. And that's why behind this economic fight, there is a political fight, a fight for the European way, because I do think that in the current globalization, Europe has its own DNA, its own values, its own fate, and basically its own project to be defended. And my message is not a message of despair, but a message of responsibility today, and a promise to act and incentive to move. Our duty as politicians today is definitely to find a way out of the crisis, to offer these new perspectives for the European youth. And your challenge, being this generation, is to build this path towards a better Europe. And I just would like to articulate this, the thought of a proposal for this project in three parts. First, I just would like to insist on what I think has a relevant answer on the short term, which is what I call the New Deal for Europe, but is largely inspired by Padoa's Schioppa proposal right during the crisis, which was to say we have to articulate reform and investment, and to articulate domestic action and European ambition. The second point for me is to rebuild the Eurozone with an actual political and economic project. And the third point I wanted to insist on is how basically to depend at the same time the EU and our European perspective. On the short term, we need reform in our countries, and it's true for France and for Italy. And we need, at the exact same time, more economic impulse at the European level. I mean, the classical way to address the current situation, especially in France, it was less true in Italy, especially in the recent period, was to invest massively and to create a big demand shock, a big demand stimulus. We didn't do it because we decided to reform the country in depth and to have a much more supply-side approach. Why? Because there was a lack of competitiveness in our economy. And the demand shock was a shock very positive for foreigners and foreign corporates, good for our citizens as customers on the short term. But we needed definitely to restore and recover from an industrial point of view and to repair, basically, the productive model. So our duty today is to deliver on the supply side, but we need a demand-side approach in the same time. And due to the fiscal situation of France, the current context, we are not in a situation, basically, to articulate these two components. Why? Because twice in the past, we decided, basically, not to deliver and articulate properly this method. In 2004, we, France, asked with Germany a sort of a waiver to the treaty, not to implement fiscal consolidation, if you remember, in order to reform. Germany reformed, we didn't do it, to be fair. Second time was in 2007 when we were on a common path with Germany on fiscal consolidation, and we stopped basically the Agenda 2010 as a convergence agenda in order basically to create a stimulus at the domestic level without reforming. So now we have to reform and at the same time to be much more serious on the fiscal side, because it is part of our European credibility. And we would not be in a situation, basically, to promote and to have a sort of European ambition without taking this part of our responsibility and without making this effort. So we are in such a situation that all the supply-side policy has to be delivered at the national level, but we have, a demand-side policy, basically, to be monitored. And the unique level, basically, to monitor properly this policy is at the European level. That's why I do defend, basically, this sort of joint approach to have reform at home and investment at the European level. Perhaps just wanted to say a few words about which kind of reforms we are promoting, and you were referring to the law I'm pushing, but our strategy is based in such a context on 5 arrows, I would say, to explain it in a few words. First, fiscal consolidation, as I mentioned, just to restore credibility of the model and its sustainability. And its 50 billion cuts in comparison to the trend to be implemented between 2015 and 2017. And these efforts, as a perspective and the guidance, basically, is to converge to 50% in 2022 as public expenditure to GDP. Why? Because for me, the main concern is not just, the public deficit to GDP or the public debt to GDP. A lot of things are not in your hands. It depends on growth, it depends on your tax policy and so on. But the key element to be monitored is public expenditure to GDP. Because public expenditure is in your hands. It's extremely complicated to be monitored, but that's in your hands. So you can commit as a government, basically, to monitor your public expenditure. Today, our public expenditures is 8 to 10 points higher than in a lot of the other countries, the Eurozone. And that's not just a big problem in terms of sustainability for our own policies. That's a big problem in terms of credibility of a convergence policy at the European level. So our perspective is reduce it in 2022 at 50%. So that's the first arrow of our policy. The second arrow is about the cost competitiveness approach, because if we want a supply-side policy and an efficient one, we need basically to have our corporates recovering margins. We were in a historically low situation in 2012. So what we decided is a series of corporate charges and corporate taxes alleviations. And just to give the macroeconomic figures, to reduce them by 40 billion between 2015 and 2017. It's key for them basically to go directly and fight for new markets and recover. The third point, the third row is the non-cost competitiveness, which is the most important one for sure. On the short run, you have to recover margins with the cost approach. But the most important thing is how to recover the non-cost competitiveness. And first, we are pushing very much for new regulations, because in France, when you look at the past decade, we had a preference for wages and dividends, where some of our partners did prefer basically investment and employment. So we have to change the productive arbitrage in France, which is part of how to modernize social dialogue, how to change the rules of the game, and how to progressively implement such a culture. That's key for me. It's not just through the law. It's which kind of pressure you put on social partners, on the unions, and how you create such a new dialogue, which is part of the law we are passing. The other point is how to implement an actual industrial policy in order basically to progressively digitalize your economy and increase the ability to innovate. The French industry basically missed a big occasion in the 80s and 90s because we refused the robots. We decided a wrong specialization, and we focused largely on, low-margin business. What we have to do is progressively organize the switch and converge the new markets, much more innovative markets, because you are much more price makers in such markets. And the German industry is a good reference in terms of specialization and product specialization as well, even when they compare with French corporates. So that's the industrial policy we are implementing to do in that direction, and to focus public money precisely on a series of, I will disclose that in a few weeks, 10 French solutions as packaged, basically our corporates have to propose to new clients in France and globally, i.e. how to develop an industrial offer for sustainable city, for new mobility, etc., etc. You have a new industrial offer to be defined, which is part of the project and part of the recovery. The non-cost competitiveness side is also how to invest, at the corporate level, and we decided a series of measures to boost investment, which is key precisely to invest and innovate. The fourth arrow of this strategy is how to reform products and goods markets, and especially how to unlock a lot of these markets. It's exactly what we are doing in energy, in transport, in professional services. A lot of these markets and professions involved in this market were overprotected by overregulation. And I think one of the key things, and it's completely true for Italy as well, and exactly the law which is supposed to be passed in the current weeks here, which is exactly the same philosophy. And that, for me, how to revisit the balance between insiders and outsiders. And that's a key point, not just from an economic perspective, but from a political point of view. Because in all these markets, you had a justification for regulation, but the regulation has been progressively conceived for insiders and captured by insiders. So they were overprotected. The ability to enter into this market and develop new business and create new business and new opportunities was completely suppressed. The prices, the tariffs were no more adapted, and no more in reference with actual costs or investments. And that's true in France for the notaries, for instance, for a lot of professional services. That's true for the transport business. Just one example. In France, we decided to over-regulate the transport business to protect, rail, and especially our railway corporate, the SNCF. So it was forbidden to open a coach business. It seems to be stupid, But that's new opportunities in terms of mobility, especially for, the poorest people, for young people, for students, for unemployed people. And in France, you have a super railway system, but when you cannot afford basically train, or when you don't have basically your own vehicle, it's much more complicated basically to guarantee any mobility on the territory. And in France, you have 110,000 people using a coach to travel. When you have 8 million, in Germany, 30 million in UK, 10 million in Spain. So that's a big business to be developed, and there is no reason, basically, to have such a frozen system in France. It's just due to the over-regulation of a specific economic sector. And I think that, stopping the system and giving more rights for outsiders is key for the economic reform and for the political project. The fifth arrow of this strategy is the labor market. And it's part of the Italian strategy as well, because we have a market that which is too fragmented and too uncertain for employers and employees. And the perspective of our reforms are, first, to restore trust and provide visibility on the labor market. In restructuring case, so we define a timeline in case of restructuring for corporates. It could last months and months. Now it's reduced to 6 months. We capped compensations because it could cost a lot of money. We are doing exactly the same for individual layoff. We had a lot of uncertainties due to the labor tribunals. It could last a lot of time, 27 months on average, what we call the prud'homme, and with a lot of volatility in terms of compensations and penalties. What we do is we provide visibility and more certainty. In terms of timing, we reduce the timing, and we produce a sort of a standard of references in terms of pricing, I would say, for penalties. It helps people to compromise from the early stage. It provides more visibility. And my point is to say, in this modernization agenda of the labor market, the complicated thing is that the spontaneous reaction of people, and especially the unions, is to say, you are killing regulation. You are trying to adjust our economy and to modernize our economy against poor people, against employees. But, which is wrong. Do you think that the system is well regulated when you have 10% unemployment and 25% of young people unemployed? There is a problem. It means that the system is not basically dedicated for young people. Why? Because you have such a rigidity, a formal rigidity, that it's a killer for low qualified people, young people, because, there is no chance, basically, to be wrong for an employer. The day you hire somebody is so complicated and so uncertain, the way you can organize a layoff and you can decide to sack him, that it frees everything. So my point is to say on the labor market, and that's a good illustration, and it's part, for me, of the philosophy of these new reforms. It's no more how to correct the ex post effect of a bad regulation, but it's how to correct ex ante regulation by suppressing some formal rights, but to create more actual rights. And for me, actual rights is how to provide jobs to these people and how to help employers to employ people. And that's exactly the reform we are making on labor tribunals, and the reform we will pass in the coming weeks in the law I'm defending at the Parliament, in order to provide more flexibility to the corporate at the corporate level if they manage to negotiate a majority agreement with the unions at the corporate level. It's exactly what the Germans have with what they call the Kurzarbeit, which is how to organize your flexibility through social dialogue and negotiation. And I think that's very much important. So here, in a nutshell, is the agenda of our reform. But just to say that none of these reforms are obvious or automatically well received, because their main issue is that we were used to reform a country with public money and to correct the effects and the bad effects and the side effects on some decisions with public money precisely to say, I will offset this side effect. What we have to do now, and it's part of what we call structural reforms, is how to avoid this effect and how to recreate equal opportunities instead of equalizing an inequality at the end. And which means that by revisiting insiders' rights, by reopening a lot of these markets, for sure, you have a political and economic issue in the short term. Because the full impact of these measures are mid to long term, because you need time basically to deliver and to have the full effect. And the political cost is short term. Because the outsiders don't perceive on the short term basically the positive impact of such a reform, but the insiders clearly identified as quasi-lawmakers themselves the fact that the regulation is not made for them. So the big challenge is when you make such reforms, you need, in the same time, a positive stimulus. And that's where this idea of a New Deal is extremely relevant to me, which is to say the positive stimulus is investment. If you want a stimulus accompanying this reform in the short term, I mean, you need investment at the right level. And that's where Europe is key to accompanying this reform. I don't need Europe to explain me and to teach me you should do this reform like that or like that. That's not the role of the Commission. We are crazy when we do so. But the role of Europe is to say, I want to help you as a reformist because you are on a convergence path. So I want in a certain way to accompany your reform with an adapted stimulus on the investment side. That's what we need today. And I think that the Juncker plan is sort of a starting point. And we had this discussion, and so was here at the time with Mr. Monti, I remember, and exactly the same kind of context. We are reforming, but we are killed by the fiscal context and the lack of investment. At the aggregated level, there is a lack of investment, the EU, of 600 million to 1 billion. So the Juncker plan is just a tiny part of the answer, a first one, but it has to be a fast start, and we have to use it like that. But what we need is more equity, more investment at the European level to accompany this reform. So my point is to say our job is to reform the country, to accelerate, but in order basically to accompany it from an economic and a political point of view in the same time, we need more investment in countries which can afford such an investment package, and Germany is key in this strategy. And one of the big mistakes would be, to see Germany over-consolidating. We need Germany to invest. And we have to push them to invest in the same time as we are reforming. And we need a much more ambitious package at the European level. And that's why this New Deal for me is essential, because that's a real way out of the crisis and the only way to reconverge. Because everything today is about a convergence agenda. Because the main mistake of the past decade was a divergence agenda. The first decade of the Eurozone was just those who were indebted and non-competitive. Just wake up 10 years later, after having thought that it was possible to live with the same interest rate, with more debt and a lower competitiveness. So we have an issue. So in order to reconverge, we have to reform, but we need this investment. Because if you don't have this investment package at the European level, that's a political killer, and that's an economic mistake. And we have basically, and we can see it, we have to reorganize in the current context. For me, these two notions, these two concepts to be taken together, responsibility and solidarity. And the main current laboratory is about Greece. I just want to say a few words as a transition for my second idea about Greece. I think with Greece, we completely see basically, in a nutshell, what I described. That's a country which didn't reform over the past decade. That's a mistake of past leaders and people who explained their populations that it was possible to live with basically the same interest rates as Berlin without making any reform, without converging, I mean, without being Germany. Suddenly you wake up. And it's tough. And today, we have to help them, basically, be on this responsibility path. And in the same time, take into consideration the democratic component of EU. Because we are not just speaking about technical measures. We're speaking about people, actual lives, actual situations. And our issue in this context is that when you look at Greece today, we have a big dilemma between their European commitment, because they commit to converge, to make reforms and so on, vis-à-vis the other member states. And it's part of the credibility of the Eurozone and our credibility. And the domestic democratic commitment of the government. And we will choose. Is it the Greek population choose, basically, perhaps, and to confirm the choice, but in the same way to decide on their own about the fact that the rest doesn't make sense and there is no more Eurozone common commitment? Is it the ECB or the European Council to decide that we will not respect the democratic Greek choice and teach these people how they have to lead their country? I don't know. But at the end of the day, we clearly see that we are in not just a technical, but in a democratic deadlock. There is a gap between, I mean, the level of action, the responsibility, and the democratic legitimacy, and democratic accountability of people. And that's the perfect illustration of the fact that something isn't complete in the Eurozone, and we have to move something forward. And that's, I don't know how, technically speaking, I'm very confident because I think we all understand the necessity to keep Greece in the club. But, I mean, this situation, for me, is just the evidence that we have to move forward beyond this first convergence agenda and these reforms to rebuild the euro as a more democratic and a more, and a bolder project. And that's the second point I wanted to make. Sometimes it's forgotten that, the euro was not only created as an economic project designed to strengthen economic integration and reduce economic instability, but also as a political project to precisely allow Europe to wait on globalization, to help reunite us after the fall of the Berlin Wall and uphold Europe's distinct social and economic model. And I do not forget, all the thoughts, all the contributions, basically, we put on the table during the 80s and the 90s about what the Eurozone could be and the contribution of Delors, Prodi, Amato, Monti. We have a lot of people in our two countries who contributed to this common reflection, which is a perfect illustration of what Euro has to be and what European DNA is. And these fundamental objectives should remain our compass. But the Euro architecture, and as per the Maastricht Treaty, has showed its failing during the crisis. And because it was the result of a short-term compromise, I would say, which has to be changed and to be moved today. And, definitely, the Euro area was seen, either as a sort of an augmented fixed exchange rate arrangement after, basically, the 80s and 90s situation, or a step towards a fully fledged monetary union that would require a deeper policy. And in 2012, there was a strong consensus around launching an ambitious repair agenda. We were almost at this point that we say, it's not just to share a currency or organize our exchange rate altogether. We need something more because of this divergence. And we have to recreate a common economic project. And we didn't deliver. And the challenge today is how, basically, to kickstart this debate again without the big 2012 crisis. That's our main challenge. And if we didn't do it now, I think that's a big responsibility for us and for you. And I think we can share, a few convictions about what this step forward should be. First, a critical question is whether the euro area does indeed require a higher degree of political and institutional integration than the EU itself. And when you share the European life, you can always basically live this very strange experience, is that we can die together in the Eurozone. We almost lived that in 2012. But you are not allowed to organize yourself all together. And there is always a sort of a complex of the European countries to say, is it possible vis-à-vis, the Polish or the Brits meet together as a Eurozone summit? That's always a question you remember, 2012. That's crazy. We need common bodies. We need common institutions at the Eurozone level. We need common organizations because we share something more. Because we are, over-coordinated altogether, de facto. So, I think today we have to go beyond this sort of naive questions we always share with a lot of uncertainties, for sure. Is the euro the currency of the European Union or just the currency of some of its members? Today it's just the currency of some of its members. Fine, but at least let's endorse all the consequences of this matter of fact and let's go forward. And my vision is that if we want to go forward, we should not be afraid of a two-speed or a multi-speed Europe. And we have now to repeat that and to kickstart from this point. Because for many, many years now, we are always hesitating between these two visions. We have to choose. Yes, unique way to go forward is to clearly endorse all the consequences of a multi-speed Europe. Because this is already the case de facto, and we have basically to go into that direction. And the failure of the constitutional treaty has frozen this debate in Europe 10 years ago, and maybe more so in France, because it was a divisive experience in France. And my point is to say now, we have to stop kind of frozen parenthesis, especially in France, after the lost decade, and decide that our unique project, and if you want to provide, some perspective to your people, especially when you reform, let's endorse this European willingness and let's go forward. And yes, we need a multi-speed Europe, and we have to go forward into that direction. A lot can be done without treaty change, but we should not be afraid by a treaty change. I'm fine with the treaty change. Let's prepare it instead of always medically running around the building saying, if there is a treaty change, no chance to move forward. But what is for at the end of the day? The first question is, what do we want to do all together? It's not a question of a treaty change or not. And let's deliver step by step. Today, if you speak about Europe, to a lot of people, the answer is no. No need of a question. But if we start deliver by investment ambition, by positive news flows, and if we propose a project, if we propose a perspective, let's organize this treaty change. Fine. We have all the technicalities to do so. That's not an issue. And I don't share this view that France would be always skeptical or afraid by a treaty change because suddenly in 2005 there was a no to a vote. Fine, because we didn't explain it properly, probably. Because we were not responsible people, I have to say. And we always protected under Europe to say that's all the bad message, all these complicated reforms are about Europe. Fine, define our model and let's go forward. And I do think that today we have to endorse this idea. And in substance, the debate should allow us to do both. Deepen the EU with the new initiatives and go forward in a more ambitious approach for single market in EU. And let me just mention two ideas that should be explored to allow further integration and solidarity at the European level and at the Eurozone level, sorry. First, I do think that we have to create a common borrowing capacity. That's key. At the Eurozone level, you have no way to organize this convergence. You have a multi-annual framework at the EU level, which is a nightmare, not to say a shame when you see the conditions of a negotiation. It's just the best evidence that there is no more affectio societatis at this level. So what we need is to say, as long as people and countries are reforming themselves, we need a solidarity package to accompany these reforms. We need precisely to share this project. So we need a responsible body in charge of this common budget at the Eurozone level, but to be funded, at least as a starting point, by a common borrowing capacity. De facto, that's a solidarity, to raise money on the market. When you look at the aggregated level of the Eurozone, we are in a situation to do so. There is no over-indebtedness at this level. And it creates a common responsibility, which is the only way to basically monitor the common interest at the Eurozone level. And my conviction is that this point is the only way to, in the same time, to create more solidarity and more transfers, and precisely to have an additional investment package. Because when you look at the Juncker plan today, there is no additional money. It's just how to repackage existing money in the budget to launch an investment ambition. But if you want additionality, you need this common borrowing capacity. The second idea is to say, let's set up a common unemployment insurance system with a common setup of basic rules. This would make the euro area and member states in a better situation to face economic shocks. It would be the contra-cyclical part of the euro area budget. It means let's create the conditions for mobility for people within the euro area, or perhaps an inner circle in euro area, because that's a big challenge. But which is to say, let's push our social model, and especially, all the system for unemployed people, to converge and to precisely be in common. That's very important. These 2 points as starting point for this common ambition at the Eurozone level for me are key, because it's how de facto to put more convergence. A fundamental political question of the functioning of this monetary union is the extent to which rules can successfully govern an ever-growing share of economic policy. And for me, the big question mark in this situation is precisely which kind of choice we have and we endorse between rules and institutions. Because we can decide to do more at the Eurozone level with new rules. We've worked with a lot of member states during the past 2 years about the famous contracts. Mr. Verhofstadt is proposing a convergence contract, which is a very good idea. Say we need rules precisely to push our economy to converge. We created this macroeconomic imbalances procedure, which is exactly the same philosophy. But it doesn't fly, in fact, because it's too complicated. It's impossible to be monitored. Look at the complexity already to monitor a 3% deficit. And I can speak by heart about how you can negotiate flexibility, how you can say, what about a series of very complex reforms and economic situations? It's impossible to be monitored. So my conviction is, if we want to do so, we need a common body. We need to go forward through institutions. So we need something to be in charge of this government, of this convergence agenda at the Eurozone level. Is it the Commission? Is it a specific body to be created? I don't have the answer. It's to be debated. You have good reasons. Some people defend a sort of Eurozone government and Eurozone treasury to say we need a specific body. Some others say it will create basically a lot of coordination costs with the rest of the EU and especially the Commission. So you should task the Commission to do so. I don't have any answer about that, but if we want to progress, at least we want to answer this question. And last point about precisely this situation is how basically to define the right democratic accountability in this context. Because if we want to go forward, if we want this kind of sovereignty transfer, because de facto that's a sovereignty transfer, to accept, to mutualize this convergence agenda at the Eurozone level, we need the right democratic accountability process. So we need a Eurozone parliament as a spin-off of the European Parliament, or as a gathering of our national parliaments, let's say the institutional answer. But definitely, we need something to put into coherent, a much more consistent way. Responsibility, solidarity, accountability. And as long as these three items are separated, with responsibility run at the domestic level, with, in fact, solidarity in the European hands with a convergence approach, and democracy much more at the national level, you will be completely trapped and in a situation not to move. So these are the fundamental questions to go forward and precisely manage to succeed with and in the Eurozone. My last point will be about the EU. And I think that if we want to go forward as well, to have a more ambitious and a well-functioning Europe, in the same time and in parallel, we have to strengthen and pursue the deepening of the single market. It's always been the cement of the EU. And the history of the last 20 years have showed the political and practical limits of expanding and deepen it in all aspects. Therefore, I propose a more focused and pragmatic approach, focused on some sectors, instead of saying, like through the Bolkestein approach, let's deepen the single market in all sectors. My point is to say, if we want to progress and precisely restore this common ambition, we have to decide that in a few sectors, we will deepen the single market. Energy, digital are key. And I think tax is also key. So let's define an agenda in order precisely to simplify, to address this problem of fragmentation of our market, which is today one of the main barriers of the expansion of these new sectors and economic players in EU. And I think that the digital market is a very good example. What we need if we want to go forward is precisely to have a very ambitious digital single market agenda. And what we need is a kind of a digital innovation act at the European level. And that would first promote better funding through more venture capital and bigger average financing for European SMEs. We proposed that a few weeks ago. Second, encourage innovation by making it easier for innovative companies to access to public procurement. Third, set up specialized stock exchange at the European level for innovative companies in key sectors for tomorrow growth. And fourth, establish actual standards at the European level for digital industry and actual regulation for common platforms. We have a lot of things to be done, but we need this Digital and Innovation Act endorsed at the European level to move forward. And I think that's absolutely key to restore this single market ambition, and in the same time, the regulation which has to accompany the single market, the solidarity, which is one of the components of the single market agenda as well, because one of the key points for me is just to repeat here that single market doesn't mean pure liberalization. Some countries, some people want just to promote this idea. That's not true. There is a constant balance to be organized between liberalizing, regulating, and solidarity. That's the philosophy of the single market in Europe. That's what we need for energy, for digital in Europe. That's not just killing barriers and go ahead. It's how to regulate, how to find the right solidarities. And I cannot do more than quoting Jacques Delors when he wrote, competition that stimulates, cooperation that strengthens, and solidarity that unites. I mean, that's exactly what we need for this single market ambition. So you understand it, creating a new deal, rebuilding the euro for the members of this more integrated part of the union, or even a smaller group, and restoring our single market for the whole union. These are the pillars of the European ambition and what I wanted to share with you this morning. Because I do think that your generation should not pay for our past mistakes. So we need European ambition. And I think we cannot stay in the situation where we are today after this lost decade. What we have to do is definitely to find again the philosophy and the spirit of this European dream, which is part of our political past, but our political DNA as well. And it's true for France and Italy. I mean, don't have an actual political answer to your people if you don't provide them, the ability to find a perspective in something more, to find the ability to promote our common values, to find our way to live together. And I think it's part of the European project. That's not a national project today. And we have precisely to make all these efforts to build a proper polity with a common culture and a shared experience. One doesn't fall in love with a single market, with a 3% objective. Definitely. But people do fall in love with each other. And that's why, and I want to finish with this idea, when you look at what Europe means, when it's not about austerity, unemployment, and so on, that's a common dream. That's a common project, which makes all these efforts meaningful. But that's as well a common experience. And when you ask people, what do you like in Europe? A lot of people answer Erasmus. It was a great project. This is why, I make just a suggestion as a sort of complementary point of all these projects. I'd like all young people, by the age of 18, to study for 1 semester at least, or do an apprenticeship in another EU country. If we were able, basically, to push this idea all together and to say, that's part of the common project, you recreate de facto an actual affectio societatis, an actual project. And, we can refine and we can restore trust of people in Europe, but you can find again what our DNA, our history, and our common willingness is.
Before we start with the discussion, I just give you a medal of our founder.
Oh.
Because I believe that should be a good thing for this.
Thank you, Massimo. Thank you. Thank you.
Something which is very close to your discussion now. Mario Draghi gave his talk here last year. So if you have this.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
So, the floor is yours.
Thank you for this beautiful speech. Really, it was deep, and you did answer my question. So you have an ambition for Europe. I was fearing that was not the case, because I am really thinking that Europe is taking a bad road. When I hear a great German minister saying that the Greek people did vote irresponsibly, and what does that mean about democracy? When we got the impression that the only right which is left to the population of a European nation is to change government, but not to change policy, have something which puts you in a difficult position vis-à-vis Europe. But you said the important thing, especially about giving a common capacity of to borrow to Europe. So you did answer the European question. About the structural reform that you insist a lot, I would say that you're right, they are important. Although I think that the mother of all structural reform is the reform of European institutions. And then we can do the other. Maybe we should do it together. Just one thing I could speak, because you said so many deep things that I could speak during hours. But about the structural reform, the only, if I may, the only advice I will give is, before making a structural reform, you have to think at the reason why the existing regulation have been put. So as to understand what will be the consequence of changing a structural reform. And that is particularly true for the labor market. Some structural reform have to be done in the labor market, but some have not. Why? Because they have been introduced to cope with the absence of a future insurance market. And this kind of reform, which are more insurance than rigidity, has to be thought twice before changing. But I will leave my remark here.
Question from the floor.
So take
you collect.
Sure.
Please, if you have a question from the floor, very short question, and first the students and then the professors, okay? Very short, very.
My question is about all over Europe, a kind of competition. Push forward the European level of tax on capital all over Europe. At the lot of negative there we have hiding free tax and tax and time of now.
A professor now.
Very short question. Your perspective on investment is very ambitious and also very reasonable. But my question is, do you think it is also realistic in this sense? You are suggesting that, in a way, Europe should move with a different speed according to different issues. And I believe that in your idea there's the fact that the EQ, the United Kingdom is out of the Eurozone, so a common fiscal policy should proceed in a way without the contribution or with a different contribution from the United Kingdom. But at the core of your point, there's, of course, the German question. So you said at the beginning that one way to get this fiscal stimulus, this investment stimulus, would be to suggest the Germans to invest more, which to me is a sort of interesting point, but I mean, how can we suggest, we have been suggesting them for a long time to invest more, and they are not prepared to do that, it seems. So the other point is, do you think they would be prepared at this stage or in the next years to go for a true common fiscal policy, even which has to be detached from the EU balance, EU budget, because the EU budget is not enough to pursue a counter-cyclical fiscal policy, to have a common insurance, a common unemployment insurance at the EU level. So the point is, are they prepared to do that, or is this simply an ambition and it would be have to be put off for the future?
Hello, my name is Sébastien. I am also French. My question is quite simple. Your ideas about the European ambition is also shared by most politicians in France of the center and the right. So what's your position about Alain Juppé, and would you be Juppé compatible with?
Marcello Messori, LUISS School of European Political Economy. I have two questions which lead, in a sense, to the same problem. The first question relates to the problem of investment. I am fully sympathetic with your view that is that investments are the ideal bridge between the demand side and the supply side, and moreover, they have to play a crucial role in order to implement competitiveness reforms. Nevertheless, in order to play these crucial roles, investments must be selected to be effective. And my problem is, do you think that the selection is a task for European institutions or for national institutions? You stated that we need common European institutions, and in a sense you also stated that European institutions have to design strategy, whereas national institutions have to select specific decisions and to implement them. Nevertheless, it's not so easy to define the borders between these different tasks. Let me offer to you an example, a very naive example taken by the implementation Juncker plan. We have a fund at the European Investment Bank, and one of the failures in the working of this fund is due to the fact that we need financing from member states, but at the same time, we need a selection of the specific investments made at the European level, at the European fund, and this is an inconsistency due to the fact that no one is ready at the national level to put money if there is not, how do you say, a high probability to have this money back. So this is a typical example of the difficulties to combine the European level and the national one. And the same applies more or less for regulation. I'm in full agreement with you that it would be better to design efficient regulation instead of trying to correct ex post wrong regulations. But what does it mean? That we need to improve regulation at the European level, or we need to harmonize national regulations. Thank you.
Very short question. Do you think that an Erasmus program for members of government is needed?
Okay. Regarding your question about, tax competition, that's definitely an issue. So, the problem, as you know, is, the rules of the game at the EU level and the unanimity rule for tax, for a lot of tax issues, and most of them. But I think that you're perfectly right to say that today, when you look at our countries, there is a biased, basically, tax system, largely increased by the fact that the financing our models and our social models are based on the taxation on, labor factor, and the fact that now you are not in the same situation as 20 or 30 years ago to tax in the same way the capital factor. And that's perfectly true that this competition and the over-optimization by some countries, sometimes even within the EU, is a big problem because, it makes part of your tax bases disappear, and it pushes the government basically to increase tax pressure on those who are not in a situation to move. And not just the labor factor, but, the less qualified labor factor, which is, not the one to be in a situation to move and leave the country. Which basically is the best evidence of the fact that part of this project, and that's why when I spoke about more integration, I referred to the tax system. I do agree on the fact that we have to converge. That's extremely complicated, and it's part of the answer I will make to your question, which is about how to harmonize existing systems. It's because we developed in a lot of countries such a sophistication in the matter of tax, and especially tax on capital, that converging this matter will be extremely complicated. But it's part, indeed, of the requested regulation at the EU level. Otherwise, for instance, I mentioned basically the digital market. The digital players are optimizing within the Eurozone thanks to the system. And for instance, they operate in France and in Italy without any permanent establishment, i.e. without being taxed. They pull all the profits to Ireland due to the very low corporate tax. And after all the cash basically is pulled to Netherlands without any additional taxation, and with a specific agreement between Netherlands and Bermuda to go to a free tax area or a paradise. So that's not possible. So more transparency. We are in the first step into that direction because we increased after crisis the transparency of our tax systems and financing systems. We increased basically all the requirements basically to converge, exchange information and so on. Now we will have indeed to converge in terms of taxation. And I think that's definitely one of the key issues if we want to take into consideration all of the consequences of free movement of capitals and people. So for sure. As for the investment, I had in fact 2 points. One is to say we need to coordinate much more our macroeconomic policies. We did a mistake during the crisis, which was to over-consolidate at the same time in a lot of countries, which was completely pro-cyclical. But another mistake would be, as some big economies are consolidating, those who are in a situation to expand and invest should do so. And today, just about implementing treaty and coordination, we have a midterm objective which is minus 0.5% deficit. It's not zero. And when you look at our situation, we have to comply with the objective and to reduce our deficit. We have to reform. But as we're reforming, in the same time, the right macroeconomic policy is to see the first European economy, not to over-consolidate, but to invest. And not to go to plus 0.2 or plus 0.5, which would be a big mistake. But precisely to invest in infrastructure where there is a clear need in the German economy. First, because it's good for them in the long run. And second, because it's good for everybody, because, I mean, the positive macroeconomic impact is clear, and that's the best way to offset the fiscal consolidation of the French government. I had this sort of naive approach, which was to say, as we are implementing 50 billion cuts, in the coming 3 years, you should invest 50 billion. I noticed that after these declarations, we had a series of meetings with Wolfgang Schäuble and Sigmar Gabriel. They doubled the commitment for investment made by the coalition. So they are on this track. And my conviction is that Germany is just waiting us for reforming. So that's a pari passu approach. But I do believe there is a way forward into that direction, but trust is key in such a context. As for the European level, I mean, Juncker plan was a very good idea, but how to fund such a plan? Using existing money, that's what they decided, so you don't have actual additionality. Raising tax, it's too long. Create a new budget, it's too long. That's so painful to negotiate the actual one. Or raise money together. That's why I push this idea to raise common money. But that's a key condition to have an actual additionality in terms of investment and a macroeconomic impact. Otherwise, it's just how to reshuffling money. And on top of it, I have to say that the current Juncker plan operated through the EIB for me should be a fast start, but it's not sufficient because there is no need for financing. There is a need for equity. And EIB is just a long-term bank, so it will compete with your CASA, our Caisse des Dépôts, and sometimes with our commercial banks. So I do think it's feasible to raise money with a common borrowing capacity without any treaty change. Depends how you define your solidarity and your responsibility. And what's basically the right perimeter. At least for me, it's the Eurozone. But you have a very good precedent, an example. The ESM, it's something which allows you, with a system of guarantees, to raise money together to the market with solidarity. EFSF, we did so, and we used it for Portugal. You have a big UK sensitivity on that, because if you remember all this big drama during the crisis for Portugal, but in the past, we raised money all together to be used for one country in a stressed situation or for one sector due to the stress situation. The question is, do we agree to do so for new projects? And that, for me, is the best way to kickstart with this idea of European bonds. I mean, European bonds was polluted about, all the references to legacy situations. But if you speak about bonds for new projects, future projects, I think it's completely politically feasible. But it's how precisely to articulate responsibility and solidarity. My point is to say today, we are increasing our responsibility by reforming. We need solidarity to accompany this trend. And I think that's totally feasible if we manage to create this momentum. That's a political momentum. But referring to ESM, EFSF, I think it's feasible. As for your question about Alain Juppé, I do think that there is a lot of convergence between people happy and ready to reform in France. What I see is that today, President Hollande is elected for 2 years again. Okay? We delivered 3 years. I will keep on reforming. So I'm sure that Alain Juppé will back us for so, because he's fully aligned. No, but that's fine, because I share your view. These people are reformists as well, and we share a lot of values and a lot of ideas. So I do believe that all these people, even from the center and the right, will back our reforms if they go into the right direction. They have to do so. And these 2 years are critical in the current period of time. As for the fourth question, investment selection. What we will do is that the EIB will be in charge of the selection in the current context, with a very complicated articulation with national development banks. And the articulation you mentioned is a very good question. I think that most of the program and the parts which will be funded through the reallocation of the multi-annual framework, basically, will be completely monitored by the EIB, and probably they will create an independent committee after the task force. And I think that it will be the best method to avoid, basically, substitution effect with other investments. For instance, we should not finance through a Juncker plan other investments supposed to be funded by the current budget or the national budget or big infrastructure plan. That's not the point. It's to finance energy, digital, R&D with key top priority, with key criteria. Probably impact on long-term growth, be sure there is no substitution effect, and so on. So that's a monitoring to be defined at the EIB level for me, with an independent task force, and with an accountability process to be sure that there is a clear reporting and it's not hijacked in a certain way by a few people. As for the national development banks, I think that all the commitments made by the countries will be in fact monitored at the national level by national banks with their own processes. And it's better because they are more close, basically, to the ground, and especially to the SMEs. And it's always difficult to articulate EIB intervention with the SMEs involvement. As for your second question, that's a very important one about how to have common regulation from scratch or not. The illustration of the tax regime on capital is perfect. That's a nightmare to harmonize something which already exists. That's why I do think that on the digital market, we have to rush to create a common regulation at the EU level, because that's the best way to make a single market function. Otherwise, if we develop a series of domestic regulations, we will create a series of discrepancies, i.e. new barriers between member states, and the day after we will have to think about how to harmonize these new barriers. So I think it depends on the sectors, but digital is absolutely key to do so. And the other perfect example is energy. Demonstrate the opposite, i.e. you have very different regulations in different countries. So we are in the middle of a big harmonization process. But that's a necessity if we want, a CO2 emission convergence, if we want the right pricing and so on. And the problem in such a context, when you harmonize like that, is how, basically, to create a fair compensation for people. Because the harmonization is never a win-win approach. You decide to harmonize and to sacrifice some interests and some others. So that's why you need, in order to harmonize properly, some compensations and some corrections in order to offset negative effects. But that's part of the structural reforms you mentioned, Jean-Paul, at the beginning. That's institutional, European institutions one, but they are key. But that's why you have to accompany this movement by a capacity to finance, basically, the losers of this reform, but which is a necessity if we want an actual single market in all these areas. As for Erasmus for members of governments, it depends on the sectors, but it calls European summits or ECOFIN for a lot of ministers. The problem is probably the actual experience and the place, basically, and the location, basically, to spend the few hours all together. When it's always in the same building in Brussels, I'm not so sure that's the best evidence of European affectio societatis. So we should organize something more open. But, definitely, we have to recreate a common culture, common exchange. That's why I think it's very important to have leaders, traveling all over the place to explain what they are doing, share concerns, and to speak very regularly and very openly. Because if we stick basically just to the domestic level, totally focused, without any exchange, that's impossible to first to converge, but to have common projects. I don't know. On a peu de temps encore. Yes, 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 we can.
Good morning, Minister. I'm Emmanuel from classe préparatoire littéraire at Henri IV and European politics at Oxford. Thank you for those fascinating insights. My question is on the macroeconomic imbalances procedure. You said it was too complex to be implemented successfully. My question is, which country-specific recommendations under the MIP do you have reservations on, or which indicators? Thank you.
What's the question?
This question will be about the reform of the labor market. We have seen that a few months ago there was a recommendation of the French Nobel Prize about changing the two contracts that we have now in France, the contrat à durée déterminée and the contrat à durée indéterminée, to change it for only one contract. What would you think about that reform? And I know that you want to reduce the youth unemployment. Then if you offer us some jobs, it will be fine. I'm looking for a job from September.
Okay. As for country-specific recommendation and the macro imbalance procedure, my point was to say it's useful as a sort of a description and to flag what's complicated or not. But the problem is that that's a list of potential reforms. That's a very theoretical list. And that's, I mean, in a certain way, that's a desktop job. And having some people with such a detail explaining what you have to do and living on the ground, I mean, politicians to deal with that in 1 year is part of the gap I mentioned in my speech between accountability, responsibility. So I have an issue with that. I think that's very useful to have guidelines, but the status of such a document is complicated. And we are all extremely concerned by precisely the right use of this process. Because it's fair. You can see indeed convergence or no convergence. So I think it's useful. But my point is to say it cannot be the alpha and the omega of this convergence process. Because it's too complicated. You have a lot of recommendations and a lot of indicators in the macro imbalances procedure. So the point is to say, if you want to go forward and have a better, not just convergence, but integration, rules are not sufficient. You need somebody in charge of part of this convergence. So my point is to say, you need sovereignty transfer on this field, i.e. on all these reforms, which is a big move forward. But at the end of the day, if we want to preserve and if we want a future for the Eurozone, we have to move forward. Rules are not sufficient. We need institutions, so we need sovereignty transfer into that direction to be completely direct. As for the existing country-specific recommendation, I'm fine with, most of the list for my countries. Where I'm not totally comfortable with is the details about execution on reform. For instance, it's completely the Commission's role to say, we have an issue with professional services in your country because you have to unlock them, blah, 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 blah. It's not because you have barriers and so on. I'm fine. I'm fine with the Commission saying, you have an issue about the sustainability of your pension system, so you have to reform. Fine. But I think it's just overpassing the actual power of the Commission to say, you should reform your pension system like that, or like that. You should reform your professional services on your labor market like that, or like that. It's not the role of the Commission, basically, to give prescriptions. They have to give guidelines and goals, but not prescription, because otherwise that's de facto accumulating another discrepancy and another gap, as I mentioned, because they are not elected, they are not in charge of the implementation of the reform in front of people, and they want to go to the nitty-gritty of the reform itself and to define it. as it is not their role. Their role, and they're responsible for that in front of the European Parliament, is indeed to work on the convergence and to define goals and to assess results. I'm fine with that. But it's not to teach me about how to do the reforms and to go into the nitty-gritty. That's much more, and I think we all have to think about clarification of roles. I think it's fundamental if we want to progress. And common interest is in the Commission's hands, which doesn't mean replacing member states, but which means being fully dedicated to common projects and respect of common guidelines. My feeling is that Juncker has clearly this view and is pushing into that direction. And yesterday I had a series of discussions with different commissioners, and we had this level of discussion. But we have to be very careful about this clarification about positioning. As for the labor market reform, I don't believe that creating a new contract is a solution. Because in fact, you don't have just 2 contracts in France, you have a series of contracts. So it's part of our way to deal with the dysfunctioning is to create more complexity. And it's something, sometimes a little bit paradoxical to see that people claiming for simplification are those who promote a new sophistication to deal with it. I think you have 2 issues. The first one is the rigidity of the labor market. And I think what we are doing on labor tribunals, on collective layoffs, and on the definition of layoffs is absolutely key. And we can simplify a lot of things for SMEs, what we will do in the beginning of June. The second point, which is different, which is not a question of efficiency of the labor market, which is the question of fragmentation of the labor market and the duality between especially short-term contracts and long-term contracts. It means that a lot of young people or newcomers in the labor market are completely on short-term contracts. 90% of new contracts last year were short-term contracts. So the market is already used to deal with this complexity and the rigidity of the long-term contracts by basically overusing the short-term ones. But dealing with the duality of the market, for me, is another issue. Theoretically, that's a very important one. On the short term, it can be more dangerous. I think that the top priority is to create the condition of flexibility and accelerating, basically, the movement from short-term to long-term contracts, and to start working on this unification. Because when you have such bad results on your labor market and such a complicated environment, if you just harmonize both of them and create the, unique one, that's a very good theoretical idea, the risk is just to rigidify the short-term contracts in the short term and to block more people to get access to unemployment. As for your last question, we can say after. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for coming again.
No, thanks to you.
It was very, very interesting.